this morning.
Oh boy. All right, well, we'll get going in just a moment. I know that there are a number of people that are just going to be logging on in the moment. So if you just bear with me for just one moment, give me about 1 minute. Okay, I guess we'll get going right now. It's 3:02 on my clock, but I figured I'd give people some lead to get logged in. Welcome, everyone. We're a webinar with the DivSeek International Network. And I know that we've, in the past, we've had difficulty in promoting upcoming webinar schedules, and now we have a listing of the upcoming webinars for the next few months. We have additional people that are willing to present material that are of general interest to the community here, and check in with the website. We'll have those posted accordingly. I think up until now, we've been really good at telling you what has happened in the past and providing the recordings, but we've not promoted the upcoming webinars, and now we have a handle on that. Incidentally, for those who might have colleagues who are interested in this or other subjects, these webinars are being recorded and they'll be available to download and look at later. It's a great pleasure and really an honor to introduce the next two speakers, because it's a subject matter that underpins sort of a lot of elements of what our DivSeek organization has striven for over the last few years in developing our governance and looking at the kinds of data that are of interest to many of us. We've developed, or at least leaned on, a lot of elements of the fair data principles, which are simply ways in which data can be open access, they can be interpreted by different kinds of algorithms and reanalyzed in ways so that new information can be gleaned from them. But of course, what we've noticed in the negotiations with the Convention on Biological Diversity and even with the International Treaty for Plant, Food, and Agriculture is this realization that the digital data that describe plant genetic resources are as important an element as the physical specimens themselves. And there needs to be an agreement that governs their dissemination, use, access and benefit sharing, all these kinds of consent issues that are part of our germplasm standard material transfer agreements. And then there are other elements. It's essentially these of the indigenous people that have for millennia worked with species, shaped their characteristics during early domestication, and have a very deep knowledge of around the use, the environmental correlates, some of the biologies of species that we've only now started to sort of recognize as plant genetic resources in their own right. And so today we have two speakers, Māui Hudson from New Zealand, from the Kotahi Research Institute, I'm sure I'm mangling that, at the University of Waikato, and Jane Anderson from New York University, New York, who've written recently, in fact, a really useful review paper in Nature Reviews Genetics from last year. And we'll post that if we can, along with the recording of this, because I think it's a really important sort of treatise. It brings together lots of different elements, and it's an impressive list of authors. So with that, we have it being recorded right from Megan, and I'll hand it off to Jane and Maui. I think what we'll have you do is we'll share your screen so that one of you can sort of take on the role there.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Chris and Graham, for the invitation to join you to share this work around the biocultural labels and what that is and what that means. I live and work on the lands of the Lenape nations in Manhattan, Lenape-Hoking, Manhattan, New York City. I want to begin by paying my respects to the ancestors and to the emerging leaders of those lands and waters. I'm going to hand that to Maui.
And kia ora. My name's Māui Hudson. I'm a member of the Whakatohia Nation, which is one of the tribes here in New Zealand. And I live and work in Hamilton at the University of Waikato, which is the traditional territories of the Waikato Tainui people. So, just reiterating, it's really fascinating to be involved in these sorts of conversations at this point in time. And a lot of the things that were being talked about in the introduction are really these challenges that have arising in this context of open data and open science. And we can see that the value of that exercise in terms of being able to generate new knowledge, create opportunity. But there's these sort of underpinning issues and problems that exist around the infrastructures that have supported the way that knowledge is being put together. And some of these have related in the kind of museum and library and archive space, where there are these large collections often taken from Indigenous lands and territories, which are now sitting in these organizations, which a number of communities have trouble accessing. And often the information that's stored in those places doesn't have information about their community names or proper provenance. The communities themselves, Indigenous people, aren't the legal rights holders. And as we're starting to shift into this era of digitization, those kind of significant mistakes in the metadata continue into the digital life. And this isn't just a sort of an issue where we're dealing with the digitization of historic collections, but as we bring more and more research, which is happening all the time, into those digital infrastructures, it starts to embed some of the same challenges. Now, one of the sort of key activities I've been involved with over the last few years is working around this area of Indigenous data sovereignty. It's been advanced in part by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, but also Indigenous data sovereignty networks based in the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia in particular. And Indigenous data sovereignty is a discourse about rights and interest in data. And just as was mentioned, the increasing realization of the value that sits in data itself in all sorts of places, but in particular in the value of big data and how that is, how having more information gives you a better way of generating that value. And so there's these ideas that emerge from thinking around Indigenous rights or treaty rights, cultural intellectual property rights, and also Indigenous research ethics. And that informs this emerging discourse. But it has these two kind of primary themes. One is around data for governance. So this is how can Indigenous communities themselves access the data that's being collected about them. You've got access to the data, you can make better decisions. So this is, a whole range of different sorts of data that apply. And as that data is being made available kind of generally to the public, what rights do they have in terms of managing access to that data? So you can control the sorts of use and make sure that the use of it is something that's relevant and responsive, rather than something that's negative or disparaging in terms of those communities. And some of the conversations that we've been getting involved in are also been in the context of FAIR, and as the FAIR principles have been used to promote greater sharing of data and across the globe. You look at the principles around findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and they're data centric. They're really focused on the characteristics of the data and the systems that hold the data. And so when we looked, or when through the Research Data Alliance and International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group did an assessment of Indigenous data sovereignty principles, they realized that they tended to focus more on the people and on the purpose of the use of the data. And so the care principles for Indigenous data governance were developed, focusing on collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And have been positioned in a way and supported in our conversations across the Research Data Alliance as a complementary set of principles that can work alongside FAIR. And so in the use of data or the sharing of data, we need to be fair and care.
So one of the ways in which we kind of start thinking about how do you start to operationalize particular kinds of policy like care and think through what does that look like. This is the initiative that we want to spend most of the time talking to you about today, is the traditional knowledge of biocultural labels and notices. This is an initiative developed over 10 years ago in partnership with Indigenous communities across 4 countries to really kind of start thinking about the challenges that Indigenous communities have around controlling and ownership of cultural heritage, but also thinking, so where we kind of enter is in relationship to historical legacies of exclusion within particular kinds of infrastructures that hold cultural heritage, but also the failure of intellectual property law to serve Indigenous interests, and then of course the ongoing challenges around extractive research projects. So we have kind of quite a long arc. So the traditional knowledge labels were really developed to kind of bring Indigenous cultural authority back into digital infrastructures, back into archives, libraries, and museums. There's 18 traditional knowledge labels, and they're both human readable and machine readable digital tags that start to specify particular modalities of sharing Indigenous knowledge. So this is just an example of 3 of the labels: the attribution label, the seasonal label, and the culturally sensitive label. The attribution label is one label that almost every community that we work with starts to customize first. And so this is kind of the part of the unique dimension of what these labels do. The icon that you can see here remains stable, but it's the text behind that, the articulation of the meaning of that label, that every community is able to customize through the system that we've developed. So there's an attribution label that really is about bringing communities' names back and why names matter within the historical record, and kind of accounting for where things come from. But then we also have labels that start to deal with culturally sensitive information that has particular kinds of concerns around how it might be shared, or particular kinds of conditions about how that might be shared, as well as labels that actually give texture to the content. Start to say, this is particularly with the seasonal information, that certain information is used at particular times of year. So for example, certain songs are sung only during harvesting sweetgrass, particular stories are only told during the first snow. And so this starts to give nuance to knowledge in a different kind of way. So this is an example of one of the labels being customized by the Scowlitz Band of the Stolo First Nation in British Columbia. And this is kind of gives you an example of what I was talking about in relationship to the icon itself. That's the human readability part of it remaining stable, and then the text being customized by a community. So in this instance, the Scowlitz have defined attribution as Squix Quas Tektamuk in their own language, Hulkamalem, literally meaning name and place. And you can see in this customization very specific reasons why the Scowlitz are using this label. It speaks to politics, it speaks to history, it speaks to legacies of exclusion, and also to projects into the future that Scowlitz want to be named and associated with their works and with their knowledge into moving into the future. So if we were to kind of think about what the labels that we're talking about today or what these kind of digital tagging systems do and what they communicate three key things. They communicate provenance, where things come from, and the relationships that are put in place around that. Protocols, the rules for sharing information and knowledge, the different kinds of ways in which particular kinds of responsibilities vest with particular parts of a community, and what that sharing starts to look like. And then also permissions, the different ways in which Indigenous communities start to permission those materials into the future. So we just want to give you one quick example before moving to the biocultural labels. This is really the example that gives us kind of some of the texture in relationship to the changes within digital infrastructures that the labels start to do. This is an example of the Passamaquoddy tribe in the Library of Congress. This is an example around 31 wax cylinder recordings. They were the first sound recordings ever recorded on native lands in Maine. And those sound recordings went missing for a long time until they ended up in the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress, this is their online record, or their previous online record for these recordings. And you can see from this record, it's a very impoverished record. There's not much information here. There's information here about the recording itself, but nothing about the content particularly. And to be perfectly honest, this is what most Indigenous records within archives, libraries and museums around the world look like, partly because Indigenous communities have not been involved in adding and informing the institutions around what that content is, but also making decisions not necessarily to share that because of limited trust around institutions that hold those materials. So this is the updated record after some work with the Passamaquoddy. The Library of Congress reached out to the Passamaquoddy, recognising that they wanted to do the work in collaboration and to create a different kind of practice around how these records are updated. You'll see here three of the traditional knowledge labels that are on the side that really started to give they were customized by the Passamaquoddy. They were some of the first things that the Passamaquoddy did before they started working on these sound recordings, because the Library of Congress had made an assurance to the Passamaquoddy that they were going to have these labels as close to the content to change how these materials are understood as Passamaquoddy materials moving into the future. So what's important about this example is it has these different layers. We have kind of the public facing component of it, which allows for a public that accesses those recordings to actually know whose recordings they are properly, to understand how the Passamaquoddy want those recordings to be used responsibly into the future, but also at a kind of a rights level. In the rights advisory at the Library of Congress, the traditional knowledge labels have now been added into that rights advisory as the first rights, alongside the existing copyright rights held by Harvard University. In this way, they're kind of understood as cultural rights, as first rights, and they sit there as part of a rights advisory. But that, of course, ends up raising questions about what that starts to look like within the records themselves, particularly within the MARC record. This is field 540, where the traditional knowledge labels have been added into the MARC record. And then this is an example of where the labels sit within Dublin Core, which is again within the rights field. But probably the biggest transformation within this project is that now every item within the Library of Congress has the capacity for a traditional knowledge label to be added to it. So this is a raw JSON file, and so the new field traditional knowledge label has been added so that any community that has materials within the Library of Congress can now add their labels. This is a significant transformation of the digital infrastructure of one of the largest institutions in the world.
And so I came to, I was directed to look at the traditional knowledge labels and see how this, essentially what we've shared this afternoon, because of what it can do in terms of recognition of Indigenous rights in relation to material that doesn't normally, they don't normally have intellectual property rights in association with. And certainly in the context of genetic resources, genetic data, those rights are often pretty obscured as well. And so we could see that there was this opportunity to use the same sort of model, but apply it to genetic resources. And this is where the biocultural labels have emerged. And my introduction into this space has been through being involved with putting together guidelines for genomic research with Māori. We're just about to release genomic guidelines on genomic research on taonga species or Indigenous flora and fauna. So been involved in conversations in the community about the way in which they want researchers to interact with them and the sorts of things that they see as being proper care in relation to the samples and the data. And the data part of it was always a little bit harder in terms of trying to work out what were the practical mechanisms you could use, especially as that information moved into open data environments. And so we've started a project here in New Zealand, which was around developing biocultural labels. And here's the first 6 labels that were created as part of kind of that suite. There's the BC provenance. And so the provenance label acts in a very similar way to the attribution label. A consent verified label. We all know the importance of consent in the context of future use. And then labels that speak to kind of the permissioning functions that we talked about before. So, a label research use to indicate things that can be used for the future. And then labels like the open to collaboration and open to commercialization, which give an indication about kind of future engagement with the community. So even if the information and the data is accessible through sort of an open platform, they're letting people know that they would like to participate in future research activities. Whether that's something that leads to non-monetary benefits or something that leads to monetary benefits, it's an indication from that community about the continuing need to be involved in those sorts of activities. And then the multiple communities label. This is present in the TK suite as well as the BC ones, but it recognizes that species don't confine themselves to tribal boundaries, and that even if a tribe wants to work with some research in terms of applying labels, they can acknowledge that there's other interests in relation to that species as well, or other communities have interests in relation to that species. And so we put it together in a way that allows, that follows the same template as with the TK labels, the description around each of the labels, around why they're used, and we have some template text which the communities can use to be the basis on which they do their customizing, of their language. And just also noting that at the moment, the labels are also being translated into Spanish and French and Te Reo Māori. So thinking about the Nagoya Protocol and digital sequence information, certainly access and benefit sharing elements, which to date have just focused on the genetic resources themselves and not the data or the digital sequence information. And thinking about both the digital sequence information as well as the associated traditional knowledge, and these problems that have been created by DSI, and that most national ABS laws don't apply to DSI. There's no ABS user compliance regulations currently covering DSI. Embodied traditional knowledge exists in most the digital sequence information, or certainly around the digital sequence information. And the associated traditional knowledge has been the basis on which communities could make a claim on the genetic resource. So often it's not about the genetic resources themselves, it's about whether or not they had a use existing with it, an existing use of it. Databases have no provisions or technical capacity for recording associated traditional knowledge. And so that means that often that knowledge is invisible within the systems or not included. And we see this in some of the big genomic databases, where the genomic data sits in one place and then associated, or even the metadata, the scientific metadata associated with those genome sequences is sitting in another place. Let alone whether or not there's associated traditional knowledge in those places too.
So we see that kind of as part of this larger conversation around DSI and associated traditional knowledge, that like in a functioning multilateral system really is going to require kind of consensus and creative data focused solutions, and particularly for Indigenous peoples and locals communities, those needs really focus around mechanisms that increase proactive acknowledgement of data provenance to support early engagement and collaboration, as well as increase database capacity to include contextual metadata.
And so there's issues for Indigenous people which were really reflected in the kinds of messages that came through our activities when we were doing creating the guidelines, and also much of the literature talking about Indigenous people's issues in relation to genomic research is the same thing around recognizing Indigenous rights, how you can be in a position to collaborate around ethical access and use in ways consistent with community protocols, and then also negotiating equitable outcomes. And so we've tried to align the labels with the components of the access and benefit sharing regime. Now, it's not necessarily a kind of a one-for-one match, but certainly in terms of being able to indicate that the consent is verified, supports free, prior, and informed consent. There are elements that talk about what sorts of uses have been permissioned, which at least provide a foundation for thinking about mutually agreed terms. And I think one of the challenges we have at the moment is in the instances where a commercialization activity is intended, it's easier to have a conversation about what those mutually agreed terms look like. It becomes much harder if you have a project that has say a conservation purpose or a biodiversity purpose, which then in the future leads to a commercialization arrangement. So a community is engaging around a project which generates the data, but then that purpose for the way that data is used in the future changes. And that's the conversation they're not often a part of. And it's often hard to link back to the right people when those conversations are taking place.
So I guess kind of one of the key elements that Māui and I are interested in here is how we can support smart DSI, in that sense being where metadata on environmental or contextual metadata is added to sequence information. So on the as a complement to the labels, and it's important to say that the labels are a particular initiative for Indigenous communities only. Indigenous communities develop, customize, and then provide their labels into infrastructures in various ways. We also recognise that institutions and researchers also needed particular tools, both to support, ethical and equitable research practices, but also a way to make associated traditional knowledge and traditional knowledge visible in ways that it has been historically erased and excluded. And so this is kind of where we started developing the local context notices. And we have 4 of these notices. We have a biocultural notice, we have a traditional knowledge notice, and then we have an attribution incomplete and an open to collaborate notice. And those 2 final notices are largely for cultural institutions. The biocultural notice and the traditional knowledge notice are for researchers and institutions. And so really they function as a means of disclosing Indigenous rights and interests. And just as a couple of examples of what that starts to look like, this is an example within a historical collection of photographs. And it's important to kind of think that, you know, the initiative that we have developed has a really long reach. It both looks backwards to the failure to properly recognise and attribute Indigenous people within the collections that currently sit within institutions, as well as kind of moving forward how we shift and change that cultural authority so that Indigenous interests are recognised from the very beginning. And so some of this work has to happen at an institutional level, and some of this work also happens at a researcher level. And so this is kind of just one of the examples at Simon Fraser University in Canada that has incorporated the Open to Collaborate notice as a mechanism to kind of start indicating both to user public as well as internally that the institution is willing to do the work with the Northwest Coast First Nations to actually bring the names back into these collections and to provide proper attribution and proper provenance. This is an example of Geome, which is a metadata database for geological and genomic databases, for geological and genomic data. And this is kind of an example of where the Open to Collaborate notice sits on the front page of Geome as a kind of, again, indicating that this metadata database is doing the work to collaborate with Indigenous communities around the proper recognition and disclosure of Indigenous rights and interests. And then this is kind of what this starts to look like within the database. And again, this is kind of an example of the traditional knowledge notice that's been added to particular kinds of data information that sits within Geome and is then shared with different repositories. You're muted.
Sorry. So in terms of thinking about how the labels and how the notices can work as a part of a system, and that there's kind of transparency across the different layers of the system. We've also been talking with ORCID about how notices or labels might be visualized within researchers' records. And then how that might then translate through from the use of the data in particular places, and then that be reflected in publications. And so these conversations have happened with ORCID. We're currently engaged with them around the local context hub, and that being able to use an ORCID ID as a way of entering into participating in that in the local context hub, as well as this conversation about how those things might be pulled through onto the records. Similarly with nature, it had conversations about where the labels might sit in relation to publications in that context. And at the moment we are in discussions, well, this was a paper we recently put out with Molecular Ecology that was talking about the need for these disclosures to be more public, and how that might come about and happen. And we're working with some researchers at the moment that have been involved with putting together a genome sequence for the bilberry, that have had their publication or had their paper accepted for publication, and they want to apply the notices as a part of that manuscript. And so the conversations are happening at the moment with the editors around where they might be placed and how they might look, both on the paper itself. And so, you know, if this is a kind of a PDF here, and you have these components of information which are always there around correspondence and funding information, and the need to maybe put in a section around disclosures where these Indigenous interests could also be located. And this was the landing page, so landing on the website and where they might sit in this kind of context as well. Just creating some visibility around the fact that these researchers are paying particular attention to recognising Indigenous rights and interests. So in the context of the paper that I just referred to before, this is our general outline of how the system operates or will operate in terms of the local context hub being a place which communities can go to, but also researchers and institutions can go to. They can set up a project and the project describing the data that's being collected or the data set that's there. Researchers and institutions can apply a notice to that data set, and then that gets sent to the community and notified. So the Indigenous community gets notified that there is this particular project that has a notice associated with it. They can then engage with the researchers and decide whether whether it's a project they've been a part of, and often it'll be the case where people will have been working together. But even if it's a project which they haven't directly been a part of, they've got a bit of space to have a conversation about what's actually involved. And then they'd make a decision about what sorts of labels they might like to apply to it. The notices themselves can sit within the databases and act as a little bit of a placeholder for the notices that may follow. And so you'll see there that those the notices can sit across or sit on the records associated with the specimens, the metadata repository, a sequence data repository, or publications. But as the labels get applied, then the labels will replace them. And so there's these elements which will facilitate that. Obviously, one part of it is the human readability one, which is what we've been seeing most of. But each of the projects will have a unique identifier, and that unique identifier will be associated both with the notice and then any labels that get applied to it. So those things can be tracked. The project itself will bring together a range of different identifiers that connect the researchers using the ORCID ID with the institutions, so through a RAW, with the unique identifier for the project, which then connects to the community. So now we have the samples, the communities, the researcher, and the institutions all discoverable. Now, all of the information won't be sitting within the local context hub itself, but the information that will be associated with those IDs and the places where that information sits will be discoverable. I think that ends up being useful. And also in the discussions about as the labels are created and then they turn up in publications, how they appear in terms of DOIs and how that can be facilitated through places like DataCite.
So this is just a quick example of what the local context hub is looking like. It's due for a release, a soft release in September. We've spent a year building this system, which really allows for communities to customize their labels. And as Māui was just speaking to, each label receives a permanent identifier, which allows for a certain kind of tracking and tracing of those labels across systems into the future, as well as institutions and researchers allowing them to create notices, and within the system having this kind of communication mechanism between communities, institutions and researchers.
And so what I just want to do is give you a bit of an idea of a few of the sort of pilot projects that we're working on here in Aotearoa with iwi or communities here in New Zealand. One of those is with Ngāti Maruki Taranaki, and so this is a community on the west coast, and they're looking to apply biocultural labels to data that's been collected from their tribal lands. Well, we say tribal territories, so it's not necessarily lands which they own, but the rohe which they had traditionally inherited. And this is working alongside Manaaki Whenua or Landcare Research, which is one of our Crown Research Institutes. And they hold a number of nationally significant collections, including the International Collection of Microorganisms from Plants. And so this, for this collection, they have, kind of plots of all the places where either they've done survey plots or where they've collected samples for the New Zealand fungi collection. And they're in the process of doing a project which will start sequencing these samples. And so Ngāti Maru are interested in applying the biocultural labels to the gene sequences that have been generated from this collection. Te Roroa is an iwi from the northern part of the North Island. They've been involved in a project that's been looking at the tohiroa, which is a particularly large shellfish species, which is under threat from overfishing. And they've been involved in a project there, and a lot of their associated traditional knowledge has been used in the context of understanding that species and where it was found. And so they're looking to apply their traditional knowledge labels in the context of that information or traditional knowledge that's been shared, but also biocultural labels to the genome sequence data that's been generated from understanding the genetic diversity of this population. So this, this species is found in a few areas, but they're kind of one of the primary ones.
I'm excited about listening to this.
And the third example is with my community. So this is Whakatohia, and we're looking to apply both the traditional knowledge and biocultural labels to a project that's been done with the Met Service around marine heat waves. So this is a national project called the Moana Project. And it's got a number of components, but one of those components is understanding how currents in the ocean contribute to the genetic or the genetic diversity of shellfish species. We have an offshore mussel farm, so we've got a lot of interest in where the spat comes from for that and how it's related to other places. And so here you can see on the left-hand side, the map with a number of points on it, which are points that are referenced within one of our traditional songs. And so these are reference areas that are significant to us for either historical reasons or important resources. And on the right-hand side, the map there illustrates the places where samples were being taken, or mussel samples have been taken of mussels from all of these places. And so in that context, we're looking to applying biocultural labels to the data that's being generated from that activity. And so this project is being funded by Te Puni Kōkiri, which is our sort of Ministry of Māori Development, and really as a part of a project of seeing how we can ground this system and make it work for communities here in Aotearoa, and to test how effective it can be at recognizing the interest and the sorts of things we need to do to support both institutions and communities, what sorts of resources are required to support them to make use of the system. And this is a slide which is really just intended to give a little bit of an idea about the places where we've had interest from institutions or communities around the globe. It's been applied in a number of these, and discussions are underway with a number of others, a huge number of communities, but also and cultural institutions. And we do have a cultural institutions network that meets regularly. But increasingly across biological and data repositories and science networks are interested in the biocultural labels and the traditional knowledge labels in terms of how it can be used, particularly as we start to do more and more aggregation activities for this sort of information.
So I guess we're going to just wind up now so that there's some time for some questions. And if you would like to learn more about the labels and the notices and to kind of initiate a dialogue around implementation, please contact our program lead, Jeanette Hamilton Pierce, or Dr. Hamilton Pierce, and she will help coordinate some of that work together with us. And just before we end, I just want to give a big shout out to our team, who I know is here listening with us as well, who always shows up while we talk, and who we kind of shared this work with. It's been great to talk and to be able to kind of elaborate a little bit more on what the labels and the notices do and how they function. It is an international system. It was developed initially with multiple communities from across multiple countries, and then of course it's expanding and is part of a much larger network, particularly around data governance, data rights, and data ethics.
Reira, kia ora koutou katoa. Thanks very much.
Thank you both. Thank you very much. That was really quite interesting. And I want to open it up in a moment here for questions. I wanted to exploit my position here to ask the first question, because I noticed that a lot of this effort is on data integration. You're talking about these sorts of missing metadata. And the metadata that I'm familiar with are the premises of the experiment, the conditions of the experiment. And you're right, they often are housed in different databases, and so integrating this. The question I have, though, is in how you might approach retroactively integrating these kinds of data to historic collections of plant genetic resources, such as the USDA's collection, which has been collected from, well, many different countries, of course, and also across North America. Would this, we think of DivSeek as an organization that helps establish best practices for this. And so I'm interested in hearing how you might establish a sort of a best practice for retroactively establishing these kinds of connections.
Do you want to start, Maui, and then I'll?
Sure. So, I mean, I think the first point is that it's taken a long time to put these collections together. And it's probably going to take a long time to, do some of this retroactive addition of this kind of metadata. So, it won't happen all at once. I think there's a couple of things, though, particularly from the example that we saw with the Library of Congress, and that all of this is collected materials. And it's actually been through then the direct engagement between the institution and the communities that has allowed for the creation of enabling infrastructure. And so there was a long conversation, as I understand it, quite a long conversation, not only just in terms of thinking about what sorts of labels would be applied, but how they could find space within infrastructures. And I think that now that work has been done through that project, it has created a space to allow other communities to now add their labels to it. So that, being able to deal with that infrastructure piece, I think allows then communities to come and engage in this sort of activity as they're comfortable and as they have the capacity to.
Yeah, kind of a stepwise process here.
Yeah, and I think what's important also about the dealing with the historical collections is, as Maui says, that they've taken a long time to assemble. We're not going to dislodge some of the kind of the ways in which they're kind of framed quickly, but by adding the labels and by creating the enabling infrastructure, we start to bring cultural authority back into those spaces so that then different kinds of relationships become possible. And I think if there's something that to take away from what the labels and the notices do is they're foundationally about relations. They're foundationally about relationships and creating better relationships into the future, as well as looking back on the past and thinking about, well, how can we make these relationships clearer and make it understood where this material has actually come from and whose rights and interests need to be recognized moving forward.
Nice. That's really useful. I'd like to open it up. Any questions? Are there any on the chat there, Megan? Just unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
There's one question from Mohammed.
Oh, yeah. Okay, Mohammed.
Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button. Thank you very much for the talks. It's very interesting. My question was, I'm still a little bit unclear about the differences between the TK and BC systems, and it seems like there might be a lot of overlap between them. Is there any thought about incorporating them into a single system and then even opening them up to other Indigenous communities globally?
So they are part of one system. They just do different kinds of work. So if we were to look at that kind of way in which I described what the labels communicate in terms of provenance, protocols, and permissions, we'll find that the traditional knowledge labels sit across those three different categories. So they do work around provenance, they do work around protocols, and they do work around permissions. The biocultural labels sit more within the provenance and the permissioning sections categories, and so that's also interesting in terms of kind of what they've been designed to address, and that's kind of what starts to mark their differences. There is deep overlap and they are part of one system, but they actually point in different directions. Maui, do you want to talk a little bit maybe about the biocultural labels there?
Sure. And you know, this is also some of the I wouldn't say it's the thinking that emerges from the guidelines, but it was certainly reinforced in the context of us putting together our guidelines, is that communities feel like they have interests in any kind of a flora and fauna that emerges from their territories. And increasingly, as you know, we're involved with sequencing microorganisms and other sorts of biota, the associated traditional, the link between associated traditional knowledge and those resources is not necessarily a one-to-one one. And so in that instance, the biocultural notice can recognize an interest in a genetic resource independent of any associated traditional knowledge. So I know that's how it's kind of been framed. So this allows them to just say, hey, look, it was from here, we should be involved in the things that happen moving forward. And an example of that would be, we've had a lot of work that's been done around hot springs and different sort of thermophiles emerging within kind of hot heat environments. Now, the communities know that they would use different sorts of hot pools for different purposes, but they didn't necessarily have a name for all of the different microorganisms that sit within it. And so that kind of connection there is often a little bit tenuous. And I think the other part of it is that, you know, just like we were talking about, the gene sequences might sit in one database, that might have a biocultural kind of label sitting with it. In some other metadatabase, the traditional knowledge might be sitting alongside there. And the degree to which that information will be publicly available, or people will want to make it publicly available, can change where you might like to have which and where you might like to apply each of the different labels.
And I guess this speaks a little bit also to what we see as so important around this intervention at that level of contextual metadata. So allowing for fields that incorporate traditional knowledge to sit with sequence information that allows for researchers to make different and better decisions about, you know, how they're kind of making connections across the different kinds of sequences, the different ways in which that information has been generated in different kinds of contexts. We really see that there is a very important scientific value to including different kinds of worldviews that accompany sequence information. information. And that's going to create the capacity for better science into the future. And that for us is really important, because that starts to embed already existing knowledge into these kinds of systems as well, so that you kind of have a much more holistic framing.
Great, thank you very much.
Can I, oh, sorry.
Go
Could I
ahead.
ask, following on from that point, whether there's been any discussion with some of the major sequence repositories such as NCBI and ENA along those lines, so that when people are lodging information associated with a biosample, a TK or BC label could be associated?
So what we, our recent conversations that we've had over at least the last couple of months with some of the folks who are doing kind of this work, particularly through a conversation with URGA, is that it's really not hard to implement a new field within a data repository. It's technically quite simple. The challenge comes in relationship to what that information is, what the different kinds of questions around sharing might be, what that starts to open up as a really important conversation around different kinds of worldviews around sharing data and sharing data information. And that's, I think, where we're sitting right at the moment, is that critical conversation in order to kind of move it forward. But technically, this is possible. It's just kind of where the different kinds of will and desire, and also the kind of recognition of what that value can be when different kinds of equitable processes are put in place within the systems themselves. Because we know that the systems are not neutral, right? Foundationally, they're not neutral. And that has led to the exclusion of a range of interests, which is what we're trying to circumvent with this kind of initiative. So if we take that as a particular kind of problem, then what we're trying to do starts to push a different conversation.
And I think the thing that I would add too is that certainly some of those those large databases are dealing at scale, and we in really that formative phase of shifting from the sort of conceptual pilot kind of testing stage into creating infrastructure that would support a larger scale adoption. And in that context, and alongside the discussions that have been taking place around DSI on a sort of a global level about practical mechanisms. So with the shift, increasingly looking like DSI is going to be included as part of benefit sharing arrangements, there's going to become pressure to do things in ways in which they might have, I think, probably resisted wanting to add additional kind of metadata in the past.
Yeah. So are there any examples in your list of institutions that are in fact gene banks, plant genetic resource collections that you have included there already?
They're the ones that we're starting to develop in New Zealand as
Okay,
well.
good.
So Mary, do you want to?
And we had a discussion with the European Reference Genome Atlas. So they were talking about the need to recognize and look at things like that. There's we've had conversations with the Sanger Institute. Back to IndigBio a couple of months ago. There's sort of kind of interest that people are aware that it's an issue that needs to be addressed, and kind of looking for ways in which that might come about. So there is definitely interest in this space, and it's also just shifting to also thinking about human genomes as well. I know that's not included in kind of hard DSI discussion, but certainly communities and researchers are wanting to apply it to work which they're doing in a kind of human genetics realm too.
Mm.
Right.
And I think that some of the use cases that we're also developing with ethnobotanical collections in the UK and in the US is another area where, again, kind of recognizing the need for an intervention like this at a metadata level, as well as kind of a mechanism that can create the possibility of meaningful collaboration with communities moving forward is kind of something that is key to what we're doing at the moment as well.
And I think that's an important point because it's this sort of kind of layer of layering of different sorts of institutions and different sorts of activities. You know, the kind of botanical gardens often a kind of a source for stuff, and then they'll work with researchers. That information will then kind of go through and end up in another place. So as part of that kind of larger network of institutions.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the case with gene banks, where those samples then are collected at one point in time, and they're managed and distributed widely, and they may be moved to several institutions, and each using it for a different purpose. I do have a question here from Brad Sherman. Brad, do you want to ask it yourself, or do you want me to read it? Please read it. Okay. His question is, he's wondering whether you are thinking about extending the contexts where the labels are used to include patents or plant breeders' rights.
So I think this is a great question, Brad. Thank you so much for asking it. You know, one of the ways in which we think about the functionality of the labels and the notices is really how they, you know, if they're starting to disclose rights and interests, then that kind of functionality of disclosure is really, really important within a patent system. Sure. The idea of where certain things come from, the provenance component of it. So as we've develop the kind of machine readability of that, and as we kind of continue to work on kind of how the labels become traceable and tracked across multiple systems, that becomes an added value to them when they have and they've been generated with permanent identifiers. So for us, that's another kind of space of conversation with particular kinds of patent offices, but it's a value to using the labels because they start to make visible again something that has been hard to find and has made it difficult to actually have proper disclosure of origin dimensions within patent systems. Excellent.
Let's see, any other questions? Yes, we do. Rob, do you want to read your question, or should I read it?
It's okay, Chris. I can read it if you like.
Yeah, I think there you are.
Yeah. No, I'd just like to thank you both for a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. So we develop a data brokering system that submits data into the ENA and other repositories. And so I was wondering, are there kind of best practice or gold standard examples of the information to help guide metadata submitters? So saying, oh, it looks like you're submitting some kind of plant information. Are we able to see kind of examples of that to guide those submitters? And also, is there guidance about how to implement the technical processes to inform those communities that information relating to their traditional knowledge is being supplied or used?
So there's probably a couple elements there. I think one in terms of we have putting together sort of a usage guide, and I think this conversation which we've been having with molecular ecology about where those things might sit, and the conversation with URGA about where those things might apply as well, it's sort of happening across different places. So I'd say the examples in this sort of genetic space are emerging. The examples which we have where it's sort of, you can see where it's been embedded in particular institutions so far, and the fields where they put them, whether exactly like the kind of the Library of Congress example, and a kind of a number of other examples of more cultural institution space. We are working on the development of the hub with the people that develop Geome, so they've got an intimate understanding of kind of metadata in that sort of genetic space and how it connects in through GBIF and some of these other kind of structures. And that's part of the discussion that's happening now, as we're starting to think about how to generate an API which would allow these other infrastructures to make a call on the labels, so that they're always getting the kind of the most recent version, but also being able to set up API calls. So if people are really submitting project information or metadata in one place, that can be pulled into the hub if they want to, attach a notice to it without kind of replicating that effort, or at least, reducing the amount of replication. But that's our sort of one of next month's jobs, is to get that underway, and we'll then have just sort of identifying a few places which will be essentially beta testers for the kind of the use of the API.
We'd be really interested in being involved in that if possible. That'd be fantastic.
Okay,
Robert, do you want to put your email in the chat and we can follow up?
Sure,
I'll
absolutely.
definitely send that up too. Yeah, make sure.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, there's Rob's.
I guess just more generally is, how can DivSeek help in moving things forward? I can see that we can ensure that people are aware of this webinar and the other resources and links to your papers and to local contexts and so forth. We're planning on establishing a DivSeek Commons as a sort of a hub of relevant resources, and I think incorporating TK, BC labels within that would be a great step forward to then have some ongoing discussion amongst the DivSeek community, if you're open to that.
Definitely.
Definitely, we're really open to that, and I mean, I think where we're at is really, we've been building this system for, I mean, it's a system that was a platform for the first 10 years, and over the last 3 years we've been building it into a system, and that system is really unique unto itself in the sense that it allows for both that human readability and machine readability of the labels and the notices, as well as kind of the possible transformation of the fields and the infrastructure to include interests that have largely been marginalized, as well as kind of what that means as a conversation and relationships into the future. So as we kind of finalize the hub over the next couple of months, we'll certainly also be wanting to share that with you, as well as have people test it and kind of see how that works, particularly drawing on the open API, looking at the different ways in which the notices and the labels connect to each other, as well as the communication systems within the hub as well.
Yeah, I think one point is for us in the gene bank world, that a lot of the information is somewhat like what the records you saw for the Library of Congress. Some of those, so we have to sort of enable at least the what we call it is the passport data associating provenance. Some of it's very vague, and so these kinds of georeferencing systems to try to peg a location is sort of the first step in some of the earlier collections. And then we can sort of then decide how and who to reach out to and what labels might apply. I think that would be something to think about.
So one
That's
of the,
such a, sorry, you go, Maui.
yeah, so that's certainly an interest from some of the communities that we've engaged in, is that, creating some kind of GIS functionality around certainly around the notifications, particularly places where there hasn't been a sort of a direct communication, but historic collections, those sites know that that's where it came from, but they don't necessarily know who to talk to. And so ability to notify kind of essentially the unknown communities and let them know that this material is sitting there, and then see what sort of engagement they might like to have with providing information or creating relationships.
Yeah, and that's certainly kind of the additional functionality of the hub that we're scoping at the moment.
Great. Well, any other additional questions? I think we've bent your ear fairly well. This was very, it was very useful, and it really changes the way we think about these kinds of data integrations. Oh, we've got someone coming up, raising their hand. I can't read it though.
I'm just clapping, actually.
Oh, you're clapping. Okay, nice. I could read that. Well,
thanks, Corey.
excellent. You've got fans. I guess
Chris,
we'll.
I have a question if it's okay.
Oh,
if we have time.
Umars, go ahead.
Hopefully last question. Thank you, Māui and Jane. That was great. It's good. We should catch up. I'm here down in Palmerston North at the Māui Hudson and Plasm Center. But just of course, we have our own challenges with the Indigenous collection here, but we talk about that later. It's in progress with Chris and others at Ag Research. My question is that this is a great initiative, and Chris Richards asked about gene banks, I think, which is a huge challenge to move to. I would personally not go to the past history and start from today, and even starting from today will be a huge challenge, but it's good, as he suggested, to, have a system in place for the future. However, my question is coming from a different background to Australia and New Zealand over years. This is simpler to implement in democratic countries, let's say, who are starting to recognize Indigenous rights and things like that. How do you handle this huge problem in the countries that don't even recognize the Indigenous people? I know the activities that, for example, people like Aroha Media and others are doing globally with UN and that. But if we start applying this into, agricultural genetic resources, we'll really have a difficult time to get into, the rights of Indigenous people or the cultural background, etc., because there's a central government, and that government, I don't want to name any country, but that government doesn't necessarily even recognize the rights. Sorry, just throwing the challenge on the table. I know you're aware of that, but if we're going global, it's good to start this conversation. I don't expect a complete answer, of course, but a hint would be good.
Happy to have a bit of a go at it. I mean, there's certainly a number of areas which become very kind of tricky to then start, or challenging to try and deal with, and that's sort of one of the contexts. I think we are dealing in an environment where certainly at the kind of global level, if DSI gets included as part of the ABS conditions, where you've still got national responsibilities. And then how those get operationalized, within that kind of nation state at a local level will be up to them to work out. We've had some conversation with people in South Africa about the way that they are operating in terms of their national recordal system for traditional knowledge, and then where the labels might sit in the context of those sorts of activities. There's communities in Laos that have been started adopting and using the label. So I think it's something that can be applied by communities independently of recognition at nation states. But it's also something that would support a nation state-based activity if that was, being sort of formally recognized as well. And this ends up being a little bit, I think, a part of just how you're creating transparency and visibility within the system to, some of the rights that might apply, the degree to which they get, it translates through into then agreement making. That becomes, another sort of conversation and negotiation to take place. But at least there's some visibility and transparency around it.
Yeah, and I would say also that the labels and the notices they do some heavy lifting, but they're not going to be able to do heavy lifting for kind of particular kinds of historical intractable challenges around the kind of recognition of Indigenous peoples within countries that will refuse to continue to recognize Indigenous peoples. And certainly as we develop this project, we don't have any romance around the nation states that we work with in terms of how they have or have not recognised Indigenous populations within those nation states. That already kind of functions as a particular kind of problem that we're trying to deal with in the first instance. So I really appreciate your question, and certainly as we kind of build and how we've how we've structured it allows for participation at these multiple levels, and in that sense it is what kind of makes it a relatively dexterous system that's not dependent upon nation state recognition.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was yeah, I mean that is a larger issue, but one that we should sort of keep in mind. But I think what we'll do is wrap this up, and I wanted just to thank the speakers for their really interesting presentation. I know that it will spur conversations around this organization, certainly in the next few months and further. And hopefully we can engage a little more directly with this development of a hub to provide resources for going forward and trying to implement these kinds of practices. And with that, I think I'll close. And thank you both very much.
Thank you so much for having us, and we look forward to those future conversations for sure.
Excellent. Good. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Bye.